I always have to pause because otherwise it just cuts me off when I start. Okay, hello and welcome to Dingometer, where we talk about tricky topics in learning design and discover the factors that produce awesome learning experiences. In this session, our focus is on designing learning that produces employability, which is a subject we've talked about before. But in this session, we're going to look specifically at how the concept of the hidden curriculum can help reveal hidden barriers to employability and progression. Now, the hidden curriculum is not something new. It's been around for many years, but it's increasingly, well, it feels like it's incredibly relevant because there is still a persistent gap between graduates and students leaving formal tertiary education and going to the workplace, and this gap persists. So to explore this, I'm delighted to be joined, as always, by my colleague and friend Phil Gom, Director of Learning Experiences at Ding Learning. Welcome, Phil.
Hello. Yeah, welcome. Always nice being in a hot seat with you, Tony Reeves.
Here we go. It's getting hotter. All right. So it felt like a good way to start this was to go back to an article that you wrote several months ago, which started with something like, I don't want to have one more conversation about employability and the skills gap. So it feels like that's quite a good place to start because we've been kicking this topic around for several months. But what first prompted you to write this article? Why do you think employability continues to be such a persistent issue for education and training providers?
Interesting. It's like I think we're meant to lead with a positive, aren't we?
Oh, sorry.
I'm sick of it. I don't want to talk about it anymore. And here we are again talking about it. So I do recognise the irony there. But I think the reasons for writing that first article was simple, that just trying to admit to a frustration that I feel, and I know that you feel and many other people feel, about how a lot of the ideas and a lot of the thinking around employability and the skills gap has been done. And this was particularly prompted by a workshop that we attended, and also by workshops and online seminars and reading on LinkedIn, where it feels like that if somebody wants to say something with cut through, they will talk about employability in higher education because that's what the government's talking about. It's kind of almost employability is the existential threat for HE, because you've kind of got like degree apprenticeships coming through where if you can just nail employability, higher education is off the hook, and it will become, the whole value for money piece will get resolved and all of those sorts of things. So I know there are lots of reasons why people keep talking about it. My frustration comes from the fact that I find it quite boring. I find it quite boring. That's not to say because it's not of huge importance, but I find the conversations around it quite boring because it tends to be kind of like a sort of a best practice fest where lots of people have done the thinking, lots of people bring their ideas into the situation. A lot of people nod, a lot of people agree, a lot of people wring their hands, and certainly from a former course leader perspective, that would be useful for about 5 minutes, and then I'd go back into my room and look across my students and look at my metrics, and I think, well, what the hell am I going to do about this? What am I going to do? And we set up Ding because we've always been interested in usefulness and in doing, because some of our frustrations, I think, with the sector was that nothing changed, and yet everybody was suffering a kind of a paralysis or an angst about knowing that change had to happen, but people feeling as if they couldn't. Things were too complicated, things were too difficult. And so that post came from perhaps a very simple view of, all right, agreeing that we all kind of agree on the goal here. What are we going to do about it? Or how can we get through the complexity and actually make change? And how can we move the needle? And for us, it's incumbent upon us to have that conversation, because we're increasingly asked to go in and have genuine conversations as consultants and as sort of builders of courses, where we genuinely believe that we are going to move the needle. It's not like, hey, here's some more best practice. It's like, how are you actually going to do this thing? So yeah, my frustrations are like, if it's that important, we need to do something about it, really.
Yeah, this is a good point, and I think another factor that often comes up is when we're working with clients around this topic is why traditional approaches to employability don't work. Because as we've said many times before, it's not that there aren't thousands of people in higher education, universities, colleges working to try and produce employable graduates, but there is a tendency in again, only speaking from experience, to look at this idea of add-on services. So people will always put an employability workshop in, or a skills workshop, or a CV workshop, or something, and it often comes too late in a program. But that often ticks the box of employability, and it's like, yes, we do the content stuff first, and then they get through to the end of the program, and we do a bit of employability stuff, and that's always felt largely ineffective. I know it was my own personal experience, but again, talking with course leaders in a whole bunch of institutions, it always feels like a sort of it's like an afterthought to employability, but because it's something other than the core content of the course. So, like in your experience, because you did a lot of this with your students about trying to tackle this earlier. So what did you do? Because you were very much not of the opinion that we'll deal with employability in year 3. You pulled it much earlier, didn't you?
Well, I to be honest, if I'm being completely honest with you, Tony, and when am I not? I used to find that CV workshop thing to be very embarrassing personally and professionally, because I knew, even when the words were leaving my mouth, and even when I was putting those things on the timetable, I knew that it was a puncture repair kit. I never believed in its efficacy, though. As soon as you put those kinds of activities around your timetable, you're kind of off the hook. You've kind of done something. And so when the course reps, or when the student feedback would come in around, we want to know more about X, we want to know more about the workplace, which let's be completely honest, one of the big problems with employability is that it encourages everybody to talk about the industry or the workplace as if these things are agreed terms, as if they're kind of a fixed architecture where there's like a guidebook and we all understand what everybody means by workplace and by employability. That's one of the complexities, I think. We're often, how can we prepare people for an amorphous, bespoke, organic coral reef of a space, as opposed to kind of like this fixed point. But for me, I mean, very simple things that I used to do. Well, the first big thing I did, which has informed some of our thinking since, I think, and I didn't know I was doing it at the time, was that I looked at my learning outcomes, which is such a boring answer. I understand to anyone who was hoping for some blue touch paper and some fireworks. I'm sorry about that, but the first thing I did was think about, well, if there are, and I know this is going to lead on exactly to what we're going to talk about. So, but this is where this comes from. That because I had some frustrations of my own around wanting to engage with these young people to guard against their disadvantage in sort of the workplace, where I knew that whether we liked it or not, there were expectations around the performance of your expertise, how you sounded, how you presented the written word, how you engaged with the hierarchies of people who were the more knowledgeable more senior people in the room, different stakeholders, all of that kind of stuff, because I absolutely knew that was going to happen and that was waiting for the students. I thought, well, we're going to have to find a way to have a conversation about it. And if I have a conversation about it outside of a learning outcome, that's going to be one of those corridor conversations. That's almost like an expression of a kind of, if you were lucky and you were in on the day that I was talking about that, you might have got that learning. But if you were unlucky, or if you didn't have that chat with me, or if you didn't feel you could talk to me in that kind of informal space, then maybe you wouldn't get that kind of honest conversation. And I was very conscious of that. I knew things about the world because I was old, and because I knew things about the world that I needed to give away to people who knew less about it than I did, because simply by the fact that they were younger and they were very interested in their subject. They'd come to study animation. They loved films. They weren't thinking about the workplace. They were thinking about sort of Flash Gordon, or they were thinking about King Kong. They weren't thinking about kind of managing stakeholders. So the way it had to be done was it had to be pulled into the learning outcomes. And I'm going to say right now that in light of what we may talk about next, I don't think this was absolutely right or precise. But I brought in the notion of professionalism as a specific learning outcome. It's probably problematic in what we're going to talk about, because I had an understanding of professionalism, which the word itself couldn't necessarily communicate to everybody. But it was my first best attempt to ensure that, because I was looking for this thing that I knew that the workplace prized and valued, I could start to assess against it, and I could start to have conversations about it that weren't just me saying about somebody, oh, I think you're a bit quiet in that presentation, or have you thought about the way that another person might be receiving the way you're using the vernacular in this presentation? That's great, but if you had kind of the CEO, you might want to think about how your language reflects their expectations. All of those chats, all those subtle chats about how to be powerful in different contexts, I could only begin to have them, I think, responsibly, because I put them into a learning outcome. If that makes sense, right?
Yeah, completely. And I think this is exactly it. So looking at learning outcomes is one of the structural things that we can do, that, to use one of our phrases, is very much not about tinkering. It's about making structural change. But I suppose before we get to that, there's this idea of hiddenness that we really need to sort of spend a few moments looking at. And before you can make structural changes to produce these kind of impacts, you need to know what you're changing and why. And anyone who's watched any of our presentations recently will know that we use this image quite a lot, this idea of Rubens' vase. You have the vase in the center, but the vase is brought into relief by these two faces. And we found this to just be a very useful way of helping all sorts of people, not just educators, people working in businesses, students, look at two things simultaneously, or try to. And the vase, we was positioned as the discipline, so the things that you've signed up to learn about, whether that's animation or geography or maths or AI or whatever it happens to be. But the hidden things are the things that enable you to deploy that knowledge effectively. So it's the ability to work collaboratively with people, or to, like you say, manage stakeholders, or understand what the business needs are, or how your discipline is relevant to those people or not. So this idea of the hidden factors that produce success, we found to be very useful in this conversation around barriers, because if you are not aware of or even thinking about the barriers that you can't see, then you're probably going to be perpetuating them. So I wanted to ask you, Phil, like, although this is a useful concept, what do you think makes this idea of the hidden curriculum perhaps challenging for educators or for subject matter experts?
And I love that question, because it's a provocation, and because the whole thing about Rubens' vase is interesting, because the Rubens vase, well, the reason why we use it is because it produces a binary. Because I don't know about you, but I'm looking at it now, it's on the screen, and I have to consciously, it's almost like a physical act, to turn my attention to either one or the other. It's actually quite hard. There's a tension in keeping both of the images in play at the same time. And I think binary thinking is in one part my answer to it, because if you look at sort of subject, if you love a subject and you are the custodian of that subject in all the good ways, because you love that subject, you have a passion for it, you have a very strong view that there's the correct sequencing of knowledge that produces expertise in that subject. So you are absolutely that person. You may feel, rightly, justifiably, that your one job, that your sole purpose as an educator is to ensure that that vase is perfectly formed in the minds of every single student that you ever encounter. So the vase leads. And so that's absolutely one position. And I think if you think that, I'm not suggesting this is a guarantee or this is an absolute logical progression, but there you often find like a gatekeeping vibe as well, where someone is, for all the reasons I've explained, that they are protective of that vase. That vase ends up being formulated or being kind of reconstituted in very specific ways. Otherwise, it is not the vase. Otherwise, the job has not been done. So therefore, there are behaviours and expectations that go with that, which aren't sort of in the subject, but they are sort of indivisible from it. In other words, if you want to be good at this, you have to be good at that. And suddenly you realize that what people are talking about, even as they're gatekeeping their subject, is that they're making all of these other assumptions, and suddenly what they're referring to are these hidden capacities, these hidden powers, like this sort of skill set that sort of is no longer the vase. And I feel that there's a binary here, because you and I, increasingly, when we talk about how to mitigate some of this stuff around employability, it can sound like we're anti-curricular, anti the subject. In other words, but I would honestly say, and this is born of my experience now, that the subject alone cannot change, transform, or move the needle around employability. Because if it were true, if that vase was uniquely powerful enough to if having all of the skill was in exactly the right form, in its agreed shape, guaranteed employability, then we would not be talking about it still. That we wouldn't be. So my view is whatever you think about that, whatever you think about the terrain of your subject, if to think about employability is to move your eyes to the left and right, it is to make that cognitive effort to think, well, actually, I think there is a curricula that's about everything else, and we've got to find a way to integrate the curriculars to integrate. And the only way to integrate them, I think, is to make a concerted effort to visibilize the hidden curricula of the workplace. And the reason why I just say that's important is because when we think about disadvantage, or sort of matrices of disadvantage, we often encourage to think about that as being very specific. So, and we could have a long conversation about types of disadvantage and individuals who are disadvantaged in different ways for different reasons. They might be sort of entering the workplace because they're older, might be entering the workplace when they're neurodiverse. That there may be issues around ethnicity and all the things that we are well aware of. And I think it's that complexity around disadvantage that often means that people freeze, and that they feel like they cannot act because it's too complicated, they're going to get something wrong. I think that if you look at the hidden curricula of the workplace, in other words, the unwritten customs, the rituals, the hierarchies, power play, conflict, all of those things, I think if we could put that on the curricula in a way that was useful, you would be transferring power to everyone. I think that's the important thing. I think that if we do this bit, it's a proper inclusive piece of work, right? It's perhaps the most inclusive. I don't know what your feelings are around that, about whether this notion of the hidden curriculum has the power to sort of be so advantageous in terms of equity and sort of producing a change. But it does feel like a project that you could actually start and that you could actually get on with,
Yeah, and it's really chunky, because it really talks to the idea of not what's the purpose of education, because that's too big and lofty, but it is an aspect of that. And it's this idea that when you come into a teaching session, or when you run a workshop, or when you design a course, you have a huge amount of power to foreground certain things and to put certain things in the background. And I've been as guilty as this as the next person in earlier iterations of myself. But it's very easy to lead with subject knowledge. It's very easy to turn up. If you ask a guest lecturer to turn up, they will come in and they will lead with subject knowledge, because that's often what they're there for. But increasingly, if you just focus on subject knowledge, as you said, you're not going to produce the effects that you're after. If you're after this idea of cultural capital, agency, adaptability, and you're just talking about subject, you're talking about power.
Yeah, I'm going to use the power word. If you're talking about giving power away.
Yeah, that's right. And so, but you have to make a deliberate decision to design for that, because otherwise you will just fill up your curriculum with stuff. Yeah. And we see this time and time again. Whether we're working with a client building a new course, or revising an old course, or an apprenticeship, it's so easy to get stuck in the stuff. We did this activity recently, didn't we? We were looking at an apprenticeship standard, and the apprenticeship standards are put together by trailblazer groups and employers, and a whole bunch of really intelligent, really informed people. And yet, what it asks for is the VARs. Those apprenticeship standards have got huge amounts of information and detail about what the visible stuff looks like. And we did this activity where we tried to produce the inverse of that and said, well, what's not being asked for here? And actually, the inverse is all the things that will prevent people from getting a job and moving on in that position or that role or that profession, because it's all the stuff that's not being asked for because people don't know how to ask for it. And it is disempowering, because if you spend 12 months or 3 years or however long filling yourself up with subject knowledge, that's great on one sense, but if you've got no ability to know why that subject knowledge is going to land or not land, or when to use it or not use it, or how to read cues and know how to get on in an organization, or figure out what dynamics you're not aware of, then you're going to be constantly confused as to why you're not having more of an impact, aren't you?
I mean, there's so much to say here, but I'm reminded, we've had this chat recently about when I think about this issue of the hidden curriculum, and I think about trying to land it with people in a way that, because hidden curriculum, as you say, it's not like, it's a bit, it's not new, but I keep arriving at it with a eureka moment, because I just think, well, I think this is it. I think this is it. I think, everything else is tinkering. This is it. So I keep having these eureka moments. And one of the reasons I have this eureka moment is because the immediate image I see in my mind, like you were just describing the apprenticeships standards, which is a paper desktop exercise. It's deeply abstract. And yet what we did was kind of looked for the shadow standards. We looked for kind of the negative space, so the negative space around the vase. So it was the negative space of those standards. And negative space is a famously difficult concept for people to grasp, because it's the space that isn't there, right? So no wonder it's hard. It's kind of like a Jedi mind trick. And I remember when I used to sort of sit in life drawing classes, and I'd watch the life drawing tutor do the one where don't draw the model, draw the negative space. I would see students scratching their heads. I'd also see, the moment that the penny dropped, their fear around human anatomy, their fear around the prospect of drawing a complex human shape disappeared, because suddenly they were looking to the right and left, and they were looking around the subject. So I'd often see that penny drop. For me, the artist that I think about, and I come from a creative background, but the artist I think about, which to me is like, this is the eureka moment, is Rachel Whiteread. Now, Rachel Whiteread, she won the Turner Prize back in the day for casting in concrete the interior of her childhood home. And it became this monolithic, sort of slightly uncanny, slightly threatening, huge kind of concrete shape. And of course, it had mass, it had density. It was an impenetrable thing. But what she had done is she'd manifested otherwise invisible space. Yeah, so you've got, this is, you've got some images here that you're sharing. So this is when she did a shed. And so, and she's done it with hot water bottles, and she did it beautifully with the negative space under chairs. So this lovely installation where you've got all these cubes, and all these cubes are the space that live under a chair that goes unused. The reason I'm talking about her, there we are, you can just see it on screen now, all those blocks, they are kind of the space that sit unused, but nonetheless kind of protected under a chair. The reason why I'm talking about it is because if you were able to manifest the so-called hidden curriculum of the workplace in this way, if you could manifest its density, if you could manifest it as a barrier, if you could manifest it as this kind of like, enormous terrain that had to be negotiated, had to be climbed over, people would start to deal with it immediately. And I'm just minded to share a quick story about, we've just had all of our our pavements resurfaced here outside of the house, and there was a blue portaloo for the men who were doing the work that moved up the street as they were repaving. And so every morning somebody opened the blinds to find a blue solid toilet right in front of their bay windows. And I'm telling you that if the hidden curriculum was a blue solid Portaloo that every time you had a class, you had to it was sitting there in the room. You would very quickly start to ask questions about it. And you very quickly have to have a conversation about not the elephant in the room, but the hidden curriculum in the room. And you used that brilliant word earlier about tinkering. The reason why the hidden curriculum for me is a eureka moment is because it is the opposite of tinkering. For this reason, that just as I said back in the day, there was me thinking, how can I have legitimate conversations with young people around the power relations that sit around their discipline when they leave and they need to sort of like enact themselves in a space. How can I do that? I did it because I was visualizing what I knew to be true of where they were headed. And then after that that process, I thought, well, where can I put that curricula? How can I teach into it? How can I assess? And I did it by putting in my learning outcomes. And as you know, Tony, there's a word for that in learning design circles, right? It's a very old, well-established concept, and it's constructive alignment. And the point about constructive alignment is that if you build your learning experiences backwards from something, then you get your ducks in a row in terms of your assessment and your learning activities and all those things. So if you make the hidden curriculum, if you get that Rachel White-Reed block and you put it and you constructively align from that density and you're trying to give people ways to sort of negotiate it and sort of map it for themselves, you are going to see some structural change take place in your learning activities, in your assessment. You will not see that structural change take place if you don't constructively align from the hidden curriculum. You won't see any change. I don't know if you agree, if that's too strident, but that's my eureka moment, really.
No, it is. And right early on when we founded the business, I think one of the concepts that we used a lot was this idea of asking for what you want.
Yeah.
And we would always use that with clients. Like, well, what is it you want? And today we always have briefs come in, projects come in, and often people do find it difficult to ask for what they want, and they gravitate to what they know rather than what they want. And so a little while ago we did just a bit of research, and you'll remember this. So we were trying to look at words. If you were going to rewrite learning outcomes, what words would enable you to ask for what you want that were not just about the subject specificness of your discipline? And it was this idea of adaptability, versatility, and agility is this top level. So we had these 4 sort of target attributes, if you like: agility, innovation, holistic problem solving, and principled action. So out of these, you can extrapolate all sorts of ways to ask for what you want in learning outcomes and make sure that you are designing assessments that produce these things. So, for example, you mentioned one of your learning outcomes. So you were looking at communicate professionally or professionalism, which was a really good first start. But if you were to move that on from a hidden curriculum perspective, rather than just communicate professionally, you might say adapt communication style and content for different stakeholders. So be really specific about what you want the students to do, but foreground this idea of adaptability.
I mean, what you've done there, I mean, this is so, and again, I mean, I'm always very honest, we don't come out of the cocoon as kind of insightful people. We're sort of, I've blundered my way towards insight, really. But one of the reasons why I think I was an effective educator / learning designer was because I was always aware, because of my background, sort of coming from sort of like a working class background, first person in my family to go to university, all of those things. For that reason, I was very conscious of the codes of power. And I'm not sure, I think power is a funny word, because I think power, we tend to think about that word, associate it with kind of like autocratic ideas, or sort of to have power is to be a winner, to have power is to sort of like abuse that power. I just want to talk about powerfulness, maybe that's better. But I was always sure that when I was designing courses or educating people, that I was always in the powerfulness game. I think we've done a lot of stuff around, sales training and sort of thinking about ourselves with a more of a business brain. And one of the sort of the key insights is figuring out early on what is the actual business that you are in. you might think that you're doing X, but in fact you're doing Y. And this really does come back down to this relationship between the vase and the negative space, really, because it's like, what are you doing? And I realized that when I was a course leader for an animation course in Medway, working with a particular postcode and with a particular demographic who were sort of more typically neurodiverse, lacking sort of middle class confidences. Certainly none of my students ever had any dynastic leverage in terms of their parents. There was never that sense that sort of this was a finishing school for people who already understood the power and sort of purpose of creative arts. That was never my demographic. And so for that reason, I was kind of awake to power, and I always felt that it was incumbent upon me to ensure that my students understood that they were less powerful than young people of the same age who were coming from different backgrounds. This wasn't about the politics of envy. It was just trying to manifest what was true. And so it really did become important to me. So that professionalism piece, to bring it back to that learning outcome, professionalism was my first best attempt. But even me talking about professionalism, if you like, was a perpetuation of a kind of a power, because I knew what that meant. I had all these ideas about what that meant. I had more ideas about it than the people I was seeking to sort of give it away to. So there was a failure of transparency there. And transparency is so part of what we're talking about, so part. And I think that learning outcome that you had on screen, where suddenly you are literally naming the capacity, literally being very transparent about what it is that it means to be professional, suddenly that's already not gatekeeping. That's not sort of like a perpetuation of kind of power. That's giving it away by making it entirely transparent. So this is a much better learning outcome than the ones I was working to when I was course leading. That's for sure.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? And through the discussions we've had recently, we've come across this Lisa Delpit, who I'd not come across before. I've come across Bourdieu and his concepts of social, economic, and cultural capital, but Delpit builds on this with this idea of codes of power. And she says, if you're not already a participant in the culture of power, being told explicitly the rules of that culture make acquiring power easier. And so, yeah, to your point about the importance of transparency, if we're not transparent with students about the game that they're in, then they will be forever disadvantaged. And you could see someone could spend a lot of money and a lot of effort going through a program of learning and come out of it still experiencing huge barriers to learning because they hadn't been made aware of those barriers. They can't see the negative space under the chair or the whatever it is. But I think, to sort of go beyond just the learning outcomes, I mean, some of the work that you did around this to empower your students around this went into assessment activities as well. So you introduced things like the extended dissertation, didn't you? Which I think a lot of people looked at you like you were slightly unhinged, because they were like, but you're all about inclusivity. Why would you make students write more? But why did you make students write more?
Well, I mean, this is an absolute. I mean, in a weird way, you sometimes forget, don't you? It seems completely counterintuitive and counterfactual, even now, to say that I had a fight on my hands around bringing on an extended dissertation unit. And that was because the received wisdom, and this is the problem, we talk about this all the time, because nuance dies really fast whenever there's best practice around. Best practice kills nuance. It does, all right? Best practice kills nuance, because what best practice does is it de-risks people's thinking around subjects. And so what they do is that, oh, thank goodness, this idea has been had before, we're going to apply it. And what tends to happen with best practice, it gets overextended to the point when suddenly it's in disrepute. This is a great example of this, because it became received wisdom that it was a deeply exclusionary act to perpetuate models where writing and words and like the academic mode was asserted as the only way that people could prove that they knew something. Now, I have never believed, ever, that the academic mode of academic writing is the only way by which you can prove knowledge. That was never my start position. I was never gatekeeping. I just understood that in a world where the literary academic form opens doors for young people into careers in research or into other institutions or PhDs, it's like that to me, giving that modality away is an exclusionary act. It includes to decide that you've got a group of people from a particular postcode who might have never met the barriers or the modes or the hidden curricula or academic writing, and to decide for them that it wasn't for them and they didn't need it, to me was like a terrible abuse of power. It was an abuse of power. It was to completely look down the wrong end of the telescope, because when it came to the workplaces of people coming through higher education, one of those workplaces is higher education itself. One of those workplaces is that, and that workplace has an incredibly baroque, well-established set of codes, and it's like, well, we need to give these young people the keys to that workplace, if that's the workplace that makes their heart beat a bit faster, if that's the workplace where their kind of mindset wants to go. So the conversation around the extended dissertation was simply that I would encounter students who would have been disadvantaged by a major project about the thing they'd come to study. So they were not interested in animation as a activity. They weren't interested in filmmaking as a process by which they could get their ideas out. They were interested in something else. It was up to me and them and my course and learning design to let those people move into those modalities so they could enter workplaces with confidence and with power. The idea that the particular institution decided across the board that advantage was unavailable to people, because the idea that the written word was an exclusionary practice. All you had to do about the written word was be entirely transparent about its value and why it's important and when. The problem with, I suppose, the VARs and exclusionary practice around writing is when the practitioners or the staff or the design doesn't know and hasn't had a conversation with itself about why it's asking for those things. That's the problem. It's like, we just do it this way. Why? I don't know. We just do. Why are you asking these people to write these essays? I don't know. For me, it would be, why are you spending time working with young people around their literacy? Is it because you're trying to mold them into an existing template of the elite? Let's do away with that. And I would say, no, that's fine. Why don't we let them do away with it once they're there? How about we give them some power so they're not disadvantaged at the point of entry? So for me, it was always about modalities and being utterly transparent. And again, just to use the word code, I know some people are unhappy about the idea of code switching, which is, the power that people have, that they recognize that in this space, their behaviors go here, and in this space, it goes there. Because the complaint often is why do they have to do that? Why doesn't the industry change? Why won't universities change? Why won't that change? And my argument is, I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm not disagreeing with you. What I'm going to say to you is that code switching, the ability to give transparent information to students, so they see the barriers, that they can mitigate the barriers, that they can laugh at the barriers, that they can challenge the barriers. To me, that is what powerfulness looks like. And I think that sort of by manifesting the hidden curricula, by talking transparently and ensuring that it's in the actual core structure of a course, that is how you can practically and usefully close some of this gap. I'm absolutely, I'd put my money on it now, but I really would. That's why the hidden curriculum is a eureka moment, really.
Yeah, and it's I want to come on to talk about how this then fits into a broader methodology that we've developed. Our sort of broadly six steps that you can use to implement this. But I think before we do that, the other reason why it's important to talk about power is for the thing that we haven't mentioned yet, which is AI. So again, don't want to sort of derail the whole conversation with AI, but I mean, we put together this idea of the knowledge spectrum, which was to look at what AI is doing to knowledge and skills particularly. And so down the lower end, as you can see there, you've got sort of lower order thinking skills, whatever you want to call them. So, declarative learning, comprehension, rules and formulas, and AI can do all this stuff in spades. So if you're just educating students to do this kind of thinking and work at the lower end of the knowledge spectrum, you are disempowering them, because they're going to go into a workplace and be absolutely eaten alive by AI, or be just completely not useful, not with no agency. And yet, if you can again shift your learning outcomes to ask for some of these more functioning knowledge things around synthesis, around interdisciplinarity, around ethical reasoning, you are empowering students. So this is what this structural change looks like at a very sort of at a knowledge-based level. If we are designing curricula to transmit knowledge and skills, or equip students with skills, we need to be thinking really carefully about where we are pointing them, because if we're pointing them in the wrong direction, after 3 years, they're going to come out completely disempowered, particularly not just because of AI, but increasingly because of AI.
Well, I put a finer point on it actually and say, I know that one of the cadences that I always have playing in my own mind around when we talk about employability and all of those things is the instinct that I have and I share, which is that employability in certain circles and in certain sort of context is one of the least interesting goals that you could give education. It's sort of like, oh my goodness, it's the narrowest, most boring expression of why we put all of our shoulders to the wheel and why we want things to happen. And the reason for that is because in that sort of neoliberal idea of employability, what you're saying is that the citizen is educated to drive the machine. It's like the metropolis paradigm. It's like we're just ants, and university is an ant farm. And I totally understand that, and it depends who you talk to. But honestly, if you are not dealing with what's happening to knowledge with AI, if you're still just teaching the subject, I think you risk calcifying that idea that universities are only producing are an ant farm. Because unless you're doing some of these other sort of the sort of functioning knowledge capacities, unless you're creating these human attributes and you're literally working those muscle groups as your raison d'etre, I think you do risk aligning yourself with employability being this sort of you're just producing people who don't know any better and just leave to service a sort of like a financial model. I think you are in that game if your assessments and your learning design and your curricula isn't beginning to sort of think much more about the capacities that actually let people be interdisciplinary, make holistic decisions, manage uncertainty, code switch successfully. For me, this gives us this employability definition that is much more, I think, palatable. I don't know, Tony. Read it out for us.
Yeah. So as I say, with the work we did previously on this was to move beyond a very neoliberal approach to employability to actually make it something that it's quite easy to get behind, which is this capacity to apply and adapt knowledge effectively in variable contexts, and the possession of fundamental attributes that enable individuals to mobilize their knowledge in response to uncertainty. Now, for me, like, why wouldn't you want to do that? That looks to me like giving power to individuals to enable them to deal with unpredictable situations, to go into workplaces or any kind of environment and deploy their knowledge practically and usefully. So yeah, I can absolutely get behind that definition of employability, and there's nothing neoliberal about that at all.
And the point is that I think employability, if we just put it like, I mean, you could probably remove employability and just say quality of human life. The quality of human life is to apply and adapt knowledge effectively in variable contexts. It is, we are talking about. I think this is about power, because what this definition admits to is that people are not moving into a space that is fixable or secure. And we can either decide that that's tragic, and we can either decide that back in the day it was X, but if we're not producing confidence, and if we're not asking how practically we can instill confidence in learners, the confidence to know that their knowledge is still valid, even though the context has shifted around it. The ability to reframe their lived experience as expertise that applies somewhere else. The confidence to meet new people and understand that, to read the room and know that in order to produce a positive effect for themselves in that space, they may need to shift to the left a little bit. The ability to sort of deal with conflict or deal with unpredictability in ways that don't feel that something is going wrong, but feels like that normality is happening, and they've got the skill set to kind of mitigate that. That was the job I was in. I mean, this is what, this goes back to an earlier point. That was the job I think I was in when I was running an animation course, to be honest.
Yeah.
This was how my job felt. This was what I really felt on graduation day. This is really why I was clapping when people got their scrolls, because I sort of felt that this space they were going on to had been prepared for them, had been elucidated for them, and been made, if not completely safe, because how can you, that the codes and the air pockets and the turbulence had been discussed and made transparent to their benefit.
Yeah, and this does talk to, it's easy to make large links, but I mean, it's fair to say that certainly higher education in the UK is experiencing something of a bit of an existential crisis, and it is partly because a lot of people do resist this idea of employability. But I think if you, as we've done, reframe employability like this, it's hard to argue against it. Really, it's hard to say like, well, why wouldn't we be doing this? And it's also easy to see that you can do something about it structurally with your learning outcomes. And it does come down to that. Often people think that employability is someone else's problem to solve, or it's too big an issue and I can't do anything, so I'm just going to default to my subject. But actually making some really practical focused tweaks to 10 words of a learning outcome can deliver significant change in this, and actually make or produce much more usefulness, I think.
Yeah, and it is that idea that it starts with I'd give you that image again of Rachel Whiteread manifesting an otherwise invisible space that everybody walks through, everybody's in it. The work, and by the workplace, let's just give that a small W as opposed to this fixed space. So spaces, social spaces, where social spaces in organizations where things happen. And that social space could be what's happening now on a Zoom call. But the point is, it's like, that this space, I can honestly say that if it was manifested physically, if we could see it, its proportions, the size of it, the scale of it, if we could manifest that terrain, and it just suddenly landed in all of our teaching spaces, we would be like, okay, that's a big disciplinary area of its own. This is a fascinating space. What can we do, and what should we be doing to turn that massive? Because you've done two things. You've taken an invisible thing and you've made it solid, right? And I think that when you make something solid, you can begin to shrink it. You begin to shrink it psychologically. You begin to shrink it practically, because you can start to produce capacities around that thing. If you're not doing that job, and if you're not interested in that job, if you don't think that's on your list of things to do, and yet as you walk through the university or you walk through the workplace, and you're doing all of these things instinctively, you're negotiating these things, and it doesn't occur to you why and how and why you're successful and how you've managed to progress, I think that there is an abuse of power there. And I'm not suggesting that that's intentional. I think often it's dressed up as gatekeeping. I think abuses of power around transparency and giving things away is often wrapped up in something that feels virtuous and inarguable, and that's that the subject must be protected from the world. The subject must lead, and I'm not interested in the binary. I'm interested in what happens if you've got a big blue portaloo outside your bay window. What are you going to do about what are you going to do about it? You know what I mean?
I mean, yeah, I'd be interested in that too.
You open the curtains and it's there again. It's like, oh, So yeah, I think it's a highly practical thing. It's not hypothetical. It's not a workshop.
No.
It's not that. It's a crunchy, specific job that you can do.
Yeah, and just to sort of round that off, really, I mean, what I'm going to share quickly is just this. We've pulled this together into our own approach. This is just our way of sequencing this out. But I mean, we've talked about this idea of if you were redesigning your curricula, practically what can you do about this stuff? Well, firstly, look at the capabilities that you're actually trying to equip your students for. What do they need to be learning? So define these workplace capabilities so that you know what you're asking for. And then secondly, really look at the hidden curriculum. So what is the subject specific curriculum, but also what are the other factors, the other skills, the other competencies that your learners need to enact that knowledge effectively and be adaptable in a range of situations. So that's where the hidden curriculum fits in there. Once you've done that, you can then move very practically into, okay, so let's do some activities. Let's construct some activities that enable students to do things, learn by doing. This is very much drawing on Kolb. So have an experience, do something, reflect on it, figure out what happened, then make sense of it, and then plan what you do differently next time. So doing first, and again, there's a lot of research to back up the value of doing first over teaching first. Once you've done that, you can then start to create what they call these ideas of spirals of development. This is drawing on Bruner's idea of a spiral curriculum. So if you're trying to develop what we believe are these 4 key attributes, so agility, innovation, holistic problem solving, and principled action, you construct these cycles of doing where you just keep repeating around this loop, and then up a level, up another level, just so that you're introducing more complexity and you're developing the students' muscles, their ability to be more adaptable, to make more informed decisions.
And just to say that mirrors broadly the uptake of learning on a job. And again, by job, let's not use a capital J. I'm talking about it's how people learn when they're not at school.
Yeah.
It's what learning looks like when you're not in a row of seats being transmitted at. You do something once, you do it again, you do it again, and you do it again. This is not sort of like this feels like a eureka moment, or although it is the thing we already know.
Yeah.
But this mimics the acquisition of learning and knowledge in a pre-classroom sort of paradigm, really. And so it's back to the future in a sense, right?
Absolutely, yeah. It's this repeated practice, cycles of practice, and just developing those skills and gradually getting better at them. I mean, this was in the context of a white paper we did around apprenticeships, which is actually quite a useful model where you are just sort of repeating and learning and getting better and more confident at these things. But you can absolutely design for that in any kind of context. But the thing we haven't mentioned is this idea of scenarios. And again, this is something we've talked about a lot, but the value of developing scenarios around this is because it enables learners in whatever context, whether they're at university, college, in the workplace, to actually feel what it's like to have to enact some of this knowledge and make decisions around it and try things out and fail and learn and iterate and adapt. But scenarios, they let people off the hook. They enable people to work and experience the messiness of professional life, whatever it happens to be, and just take some decisions or imagine themselves taking those decisions. So scenarios are another really powerful tool for helping you teach the hidden curriculum. If the hidden curriculum is about identifying what these invisible barriers are, scenarios are how you can model what it's like to have to deal with those barriers, aren't they?
That's right, because the point about scenarios is that this is not the same as, like, if you all remember those GCSE maths papers where it was like Janet and Jim have like a packet of sweets and Janet has 5. I mean, that scenario is sort of like situated maths. We know that the situation helps people go, okay, this isn't just some abstract thing in my head. The thing about scenario-based learning and sort of simulations in that sort of genre is simply that what you can do, you can produce imperfect, poor practice, conflict-based situations that admit to and make transparent what it is to be a human working with other humans, collaboratively or otherwise, trying to get some goal to happen. And it is only when you invite that reality in that you realize just how little your subject specificity is going to help you. Because in a way, your subject specificity is the key to the kingdom. It got you in. It got you in the club. You've got it all in common. Now what are you going to do? Now what happens? It's like I think the idea that the idea that universities are sort of existentially reassured by the fact that they are where great subject knowledge comes from. I think that sorry to break it to you, but subject knowledge is your base level expectation. That is like, hello,
So what?
of course you've done that, and so what? And I think scenario-based learning is interesting because we've done something recently when we went to India where we just were able to model what's really effective, and what people really remember about their own knowledge in application. And we produced all of that through producing these scenarios, which were fictional, but of course, absolutely situated in the stuff of life.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, conscious of time. So I think just to round it off, what I've tried to do is just pull together just a few bullet points there. Just so if you wanted to put this into practice, I think the first step is to just start by mapping the hidden curriculum in your disciplines, which sounds like a very easy thing to do, but I bet you will end up with a Rachel Whiteread sized lump of shed on your desk, or a blue Portaloo, because it's big. I think if you haven't explored the hidden curriculum, or maybe you've come at it and gone, well, yeah, obviously my students are learning how to collaborate and communicate, and it's like, but are they, and how much is that actually part of the formal learning experience, or how much are you assuming that they will pick it up? And this goes back to
how transparent are you being? What conversations are you having around where power resides? Powerfulness resides in terms of skills acquisition. Are you being transparent? I think it's a paradox, and I'll be quiet in a minute, but it's a paradox between manifesting this massive solid object in order to be entirely transparent, and you do both of those jobs, and the net result should be that then you can start to say, right, how do we put this in where people can actually have an experience of it themselves?
Yeah, and this is where, again, so this is, once you've mapped it, then you've rewritten your learning outcomes, which is how you ask for it. You ask learners to achieve those things and demonstrate their mastery of that particular thing, attribute. How you teach it is you design scenario-based learning, or you certainly incorporate a degree of scenario-based learning, because that's how you model the complexities involved in developing, acquiring, strengthening some of these quite complex attributes. Adaptability is great, it's a word, but how do you teach someone to be adaptable? That's a whole curriculum right there, in terms of repeated cycles of practice, testing, iterating, problems, curveballs, dealing with uncertainty and ambiguity. And again, that's where the spiral curriculum is really helpful. So then look at what spiraling looks like. What does a basic expression of that problem or that attribute look like? What does a really complex one look like? How do you take learners from here to here, whether that's across 4 weeks, 10 weeks, 3 years? And then make sure that you're creating assessment that enables you to see that. So you're not just evaluating their subject knowledge, you're absolutely able to see how their these skills, these attributes are developing and strengthening, that you're not just leaving that to the end and just going, well, let's hope they do a presentation. It's like, how do you make sure that you're actually assessing whether those learners have developed the skills that you intended?
And I would say about spiral curriculum too is, if you're worried about inclusivity, if you're having conversations around inclusivity, the idea that everybody gets another bite of the cherry. So in terms of sort of scaffolding risk and psychological safety and all of those ideas about how do you manage, if you're going to create scenarios, or if you're going to produce unpredictability in a curriculum, if you're going to put people through something, then the idea that you say at the very outset that this is based on a spiral curriculum, which means that you'll go through a thing that is potentially difficult, and then you'll have an opportunity to go through it again, and you'll draw on those skills. That level of transparency, I was always very clear with even in when I was kind of like that kind of wet behind the ears sort of educator, that just saying why you were doing something and why they were learning it in the way that they were, and how the sequence and how the curricula slotted together, having those incredibly transparent conversations was already, I didn't realize, Tony told me later, but it was already because I was conscious of power and conscious of who I wanted to have it by the end of the experience. I didn't want it. I wanted it to leave me. And one of the ways that you do that is you just tell people what you are doing and why. And the spiral curriculum, I think, is an incredibly transparent expression of what you're doing and why.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, this idea of transparency is just so important in addressing these idea of codes of power, giving students cultural capital, and breaking through that bias, that kind of implicit bias that we all have. But putting that on the table to say this is the landscape that you're going to need to be navigating, and it isn't just your subject knowledge; it's all these other hidden factors. So hidden curriculum, super powerful. Thank you, Phil. Really good exploration of that. And if you're watching this, I hope you found that useful. Check us out, ding.global. I'll put the link to that apprenticeship white paper in the recording under this. So do download that, and do get in touch if you have any questions about hidden curriculum or anything that we discussed today. We're always happy to have a chat about structural issues to learning design, or generally anything else.
Well, I'm just off to use that blue portal.
The blue portal. Probably move it to the next house along. Yeah. All right. Thanks, Phil. Cheers for today.